Welcome back, or welcome. If this is your first encounter with our Multiverse Symposium on, about, and beyond Fujiko Nakaya, I'm pleased to introduce our last three guests of the day, starting from Michel Lecour, who is curator, writer, art historian, and Marlene Hess, curator of painting and sculpture at MoMA. She worked on a beautiful show on art and technology, whose title was New Order, and on a groundbreaking display of cooperation with Amy Silman when the new MoMA extension opened 3 years ago. And she's now preparing a book on experiments in art and technology. We'll be following Hiroko Tasaka, who is curator of the Department of Moving Images at the Tokyo Photographic Art Museum. She's also co-directing the Yebizu International Festival for Art and Alternative Vision. And she's been working with Fujiko Nakaya in the past, as we learned this morning from Anne-Marie Duguet, this afternoon from Anne-Marie Duguet. And last but not least, Catherine Wood, who is Director of Program at Tate Modern and formerly Senior Curator of Performance, International Art Performance, actually, to be more precise. Among the many exhibitions she worked, notably one on Bob Rauschenberg, and mentioned because it's a direct connection to Fujiko Nakaya, The World as a Stage. She wrote a fundamental book on performance and contemporary art in 2018, but particularly she worked with Fujiko Nakaya in 2017, and you can see a trace of this collaboration in the show, where the sculpture by Fujiko Nakaya is at Tate Modern under the new building by Herzog and de Meuron is featured. So I hand now over to Michel Lecour, who will begin, and we are very looking forward to this last panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That's a fantastic introduction and for having all of us today. So I think we'll start with basically a little bit of history. We were looking at some of the experimental video practices of Nakaya earlier, but what I want to take a detour back into now is an extraordinary project called the Pepsi Pavilion, which you see here, and which was created for Expo 70, the World's Fair in Osaka, Japan, in 1970 by the collective called Experiments in Art and Technology. And this is a collective that was founded in 1966 by artists and engineers, including Robert Rauschenberg and the Bell Labs engineer Billy Kluver, but also became a global network of branches of EAT, as it was called, and including Fujiko Nakaya. So this is this stunning dome surrounded by a fog created by Nakaya. It was her first fog sculpture, and you see this here with the people entering into the tunnel on the right. It was part of Expo 70, which you see here, a kind of techno-utopian pomp and circumstance celebrating the brave new world after the war. It was the first World's Fair in Asia ever, and you can see many different kinds of national pavilions, but also corporate pavilions, of which Pepsi was one. And to make a long story very, very short, the Pepsi Pavilion came about with almost a series of chance encounters. A Pepsi executive in New York, upstate New York, happened to live next door to an artist named Robert Breer, who was part of this new group, Experiments in Art and Technology, and basically said, hey, do you want to do something? We have a pavilion at Expo 70 coming up. So you see here on the slanted entrance to the dome, more than 70 artists, engineers, architects, construction workers, et cetera, who worked to make this project happen. And on the right, you see an engineer and an artist, and it's easy actually to tell who is who. And just to give a very, very short background, many of the engineers who worked with Experiments in Art and Technology, this group, came in America from Bell Labs. You see Bell Labs, this kind of compound building. It was in New Jersey, and this warren of networks actually housed some of the most breakthrough technologies, countless Nobel Prizes of the 20th century. The famous anechoic chamber on the left, on the lower right, the invention of the laser, and on the upper right, Billy Kluver, this Swedish physicist that I'd mentioned, who's a founder of EAT, with a neon red letter that he made for Jasper Johns in 1962. And here you see Fujiko, Nakaya, on the left, with Robert Breer, the artist I mentioned, who lived in upstate New York, happened to be the neighbor of this Pepsi executive. And they're standing with a few of Robert Breer's slowly moving kinetic fiberglass sculptures, these domes, one of which is at Brandhorst right now, that were made out of fiberglass and were on these motors that would slowly move around, actually the plaza in front of the dome. Nakaya had met Rauschenberg during Merce Cunningham's world tour in 1964, and as I think many of you have heard, she had herself experimented with clouds as a medium, creating small-scale mists as part of an investigation of environment art and intermedia in Japan prior to 1970. Her father was also a physicist and scientist looking at clouds, and I will just say one of my personal connections is that I am also the daughter of a physicist who also did not really follow in those footsteps, so I've always felt very akin to Nakaya. You can see here the construction of the dome, and it's a kind of faux geodesic dome designed by a contract architect. And as Nakaya said, she had first proposed a fog piece for the interior of this pavilion, but then Billy Kluver and others said, well, how about doing it outside? And in part, the group had been trying to figure out how to hide the building because they thought it was so ugly. And then this collaboration ensued. So you see Fujiko on the left with actually the architect, John Pierce. On the right, David Tudor and Robert Breer. Tudor is an experimental composer. And they were really just going through a lot of experimentation, a lot of trial and error for all the different components of this multifaceted pavilion. The fog itself was an extremely difficult proposition. The energy it would take to achieve the pressure necessary to create water droplets that were small enough to not just condense and fall right away, that energy was enormous, far greater than possible at the site of the expo. So a lot of testing ensued, and you see here some wind tunnel tests at the university in Kyoto, and a diagram of the nozzles that eventually would be placed along the surface of the dome exterior. And Nakaya said she knew she didn't want to use any chemicals, and cooling the air to form a natural fog was just too expensive. So the only way was to spray. So she went all over Japan looking for the right spray nozzle. And again, that problem was that most nozzles create too many big droplets, you lose too much water, you get too wet. And she didn't just want to create a layer of fog hovering above. It was very important for her that people went into the fog. So after a long search, after she almost gave up, again, Kluver called her from New York and said, I think I found someone who made an agricultural fog for irrigation purposes. This is an engineer in California named Tom Mee. So Fujiko Nakaya flew to California to meet with this engineer and said she wanted a pure water fog that people can walk into. The droplets had to be the same size as a natural fog because she wanted it to interact with the outside air instead of being self-contained. Nakaya and the team ultimately created this system of tiny nozzles, 1/10,000th of an inch in diameter, and these would spray the water droplets and break them up with the needed pressure to create a fog. And with that cloud engineer in America, Nakaya devised essentially a wholly new form, a pure water fog with no chemicals, an enormous atmospheric sculpture that had never been produced before. And she is seen here in the terrific animal print coat with Billy Kluver and an engineer looking at the water pump system, and then you see the installation of the nozzles on the roof. And Nakaya had also said that she was interested in this cloud forming with temperature variation, so that when it gets hotter, it evaporates, it kind of goes away, and then the cycle repeats. And she developed techniques for changing the direction of the fog, of the kind of convection in the air. She didn't want this kind of ether. She wanted it to be tangible, to, quote, feel soft and cool to the skin, to disappear in, to feel and smell. And it should also be vulnerable to atmospheric conditions, so it would make visible what were otherwise invisible dynamics of the atmosphere, as she called it, a, quote, negative sculpture of the environment, a kind of eliciting or bringing forth of the moisture that's already in the air all around us. And in practice, the fog was so thick, it drenched you and you just couldn't see your hand even in front of your face. And as you've seen, I think, in some of the sculptures here. The first day of the expo, in fact, the authorities thought the fog was smoke and called the fire department. And you see here just a number of images of the fog swirling around outside the dome and throughout and into the air. And here again, engulfing the dome and becoming this kind of all surrounding mist. And just one more view with Robert Breer's slowly moving fiberglass sculptures around the front. The interior of the pavilion was actually a fully spherical mirrored dome, and you see a test prototype here just to show you what it looked like. This was in a marine hangar in California, and the dome construction was actually made by the same engineers and out of the same type of material as the people who made the first global telecommunications satellites. These were passive satellites. You see on the left a version called Pagios, but there was also a first version in 1960 called Echo 1. These were basically made out of mylar as balloons, and you sent them into space and you could beam up a radio signal and it would just simply reflect back down. You see on the right a cutaway of the dome construction, and inside what they did was actually create a negative pressure Melanex dome, so it's like a balloon that sucked to the sides and created this spherical shape. And inside, what you would get were these totally extraordinary, dazzling reflections that were inverted and three-dimensional. You can see this actually choreographer dancer here and this perfect view of what it would look like for this inverted three-dimensional reflection that you could actually walk around and see in the round with parallax as if it were hanging in front of you. And then you get these vertiginous kind of multiple reflections over and over throughout the space in the dome that created this very uncanny, surreal, kind of unmoored space. And just to give you a little bit of an explanation, which I think actually relates interestingly to the convex lens film of Fujiko Nakaya's father, but in the language of optics, what you saw in the spherical mirror dome were called real images. Images that are produced by the actual convergence of light rays. So you see on the top images on a curved surface that are actually, the light rays are bouncing in front of the mirror, so the image will seem to hang in front of the mirrored surface. And so these are different from what are called virtual images, and you see the diagram on the bottom right, which we normally see in a flat mirror. And that's only because of the appearance of converging rays. We see an image that is right side up in a normal mirror and that appears behind the mirror. And you can see here on the bottom right how those rays are just being bounced off, and so there's an image that looks like it's behind the surface of the mirror. But so again, in the pavilion, the real images hung in front of the surface in the same space as the viewer. And so rather than returning a body or your own reflection that's vertically oriented, commensurate with your own, the pavilion images were palpable and marvelously illusionistic, but at the same time inverted, unmoored, and totally uncanny. And these real images then were not so real after all. And you see here another view where, of course, light doesn't just bounce once. So you don't just get a hanging, inverted, three-dimensional image. You get many of them, and you get real reflections of virtual images and virtual reflections of real images over and over and over in a dizzying kind of mise en abyme. And the engineers said, quote, "No two people in the dome can have exactly the same image world. The dome was composed of an infinity of worlds." And then inside, you also had a wireless radio network of sounds. And you see this wonderful participant here holding a handset, and you see the handset on the lower right. And you could carry the handset around and get basically experimental sound beaming at you, compositions by John Cage, David Tudor, and other Fluxus and Japanese composers as well. So at the same time that you have this bid to launch a global telecommunications satellite, as you see on the left, from that very same material, you have a kind of fantastical network inside this equally fantastical dome. And so that mirror, that virtual network, is a kind of vertiginous loss of stable reference. The subject is kind of lost in this vortex of dizzying reflections and waves. But then the fog outside turns an ephemeral form into something that is resolutely physical and material, a kind of palpable experience. And this overlay of these two almost diametrically opposed experiences, I think, creates this kind of alternate experience, doing away with easy dualities between subject and object, material and virtual, and a kind of almost alternate network of experiences. And again, this is at the same time that AT&T, which owns Bell Labs, where many of these scientists are coming from, is trying to build what they call an interplanetary telecommunications network. So this dream, unfortunately, was not to be of this alternate network. To make another long story short, very soon after the pavilion opened, the Pepsi executives thought this was too crazy. And they actually changed the music and shut down the live programming inside. And the soundtrack was now Disney's It's a Small World. They kicked EAT out of the pavilion and put their own people in to program for the rest of the fair. And just one other side note that I think is very poetic is at the same time, or a little bit before that, Bell Labs moves into a new corporate headquarters designed by Eero Saarinen, also in the States. But you see this gleaming new modernist building where the fantastical involutions of that mirrored dome and the palpable fog are now stretched into what they called the largest mirror ever. And this, you see the clouds reflected now in this conventional, quote unquote, virtual image. And then just to jump very, very far into the future, I just wanted to talk for a second about a personal experience I had with Fujiko, interviewing her and seeing really, for one of the first times, her fog in actuality, and this was at the Glass House, also in the States, in Connecticut. And the Glass House is, of course, this famous structure built by the architect Philip Johnson in 1949, and this fog work Nakaya called Veil in 2014. And in Veil, the conditions of visibility were really unique because you could actually see the fog from inside within the glass house. And it's completely different between inside and outside. Outside, it envelops the whole building, but it's also, of course, very tactile. You physically enter the fog and you're blinded, but inside the house, oh, maybe that's the last picture I had. Inside the house, you can see everything that the fog and the air are doing. So again, it would be kind of easy to see this, even in 2014, as a almost dialectical critique of modernist transparency and everything that the Glass House stood for. But I think, like the Pepsi Pavilion, like so many of the works that we see here, Nakaya's work used the fog as a kind of inversion, a way to turn different kinds of structures, whether they're corporate or technological or act modernist, into something else altogether. And that's the magic that I think she has left us with. So I'll just end there and then pass on the baton.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's again a beautiful insight in a very important part of the career of Fujiko that we couldn't really feature in the exhibition. There is a beautiful drawing, perhaps you saw it, and an image, a drawing, a preparation drawing for the pavilion, the Osaka pavilion. We now with Hiroko Tasaka, we tackle another aspect of the life of Fujiko Nakaya, and particularly an aspect that is featured in the exhibition, but in the galleries upstairs. And I'm sure you will be also stressing and providing wonderful insight in this world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Sarah, Andrea, and teams of the Haus der Kunst and Fujiko Nakaya and Process Art and Ukichiro Nakaya Foundation for inviting me here today. Yes, I'm curator of Tokyo Photographic Art Museum, but I worked in Fujiko's office from the early to late 2000s. So I wanted to talk the very practical things. So initially Fujiko should be here to speak, but since she is not here, I may not be able to replace her, but I try to discuss some essential points in her activities. The title of this talk is Order in Chaos, I put, and this is also one of the sections of this exhibition. And because it is a word that connects Fujiko's father, the physicist Ukichiro Nakaya, and his teacher, Torahiko Terada, as well as Fujiko's request. And simply put, it means an order that exists in complex natural phenomena. Terada was a Japanese physicist who also worked to educate a wide leadership through his essays on various natural phenomena, showing how interesting what happens around us is from the viewpoint of science. He was one of the first to recognize that there are many complex scientific phenomena in nature that Western science cannot capture, but are still exciting and critical from a scientific perspective. Long before the fluctuations, chaos theory, complex systems, and computers, he was a leading figure in making science accessible to people through this way of looking at things. The idea of traversing the connection between science and art in terms of how to grasp the unresolvable problems of natural phenomena not only significantly influenced Ukichiro's practice, but it's also an essential element in considering Fujiko's work. I worked in Fujiko's office from early to late 2000. Fujiko had not presented many of her folk sculptures in museum like now. At the time I was there, and it was just time to try to do so gradually. The image you are looking at now is an installation of folk projected onto video footage of a collaboration with Tricia Brown in 1980. Fujiko created installation for Tricia Brown's solo exhibition in 2002, where the folk existed within the museum and people could experience it. From the beginning, Fujiko has not actively considered exhibiting folk in a museum. The background behind Fujiko's folk sculptures and her video art is the influence from the counterculture of the 1970s and her opposition, resistance to the authority of art. As she said in a recent interview, she said, "I wanted to expand art, not be bound by the system of art authority." This exhibition here, title is Folk Life. And for her, folk is not something to be appreciated from afar, but something alive, a medium for experiencing nature and humans. Her attitude of distancing herself from the art system is evident in her promotion of independent video gallery scans, mainly in the 80s, and in the mainly videos and media artists she has supported. She has also made curatorial attempts which connected the perspective of her father, Ukichiro Nakaya, who traversed the realms of science and art, with that of contemporary artists through the creation. The image, so Michelle did a very precise explanation. Fujiko spent her school years in the United States, where art lectures in collage were always on composition, and she always painted decomposition series, oil paintings, in her practical classes. And she ended up in the world of infinity circulation of clouds, where the processes of condensation of water vapor to produce fog particles, evaporation of fog particles back to the atmosphere always coincide. With this awareness, Fujiko exhibited her folk sculpture at the 1917 Osaka World Expo Pepsi Pavilion by EAT. Two conditions for the folk sculpture emphasize the experience of people entering the pavilion. First, the folk had to be made of pure water, not chemicals. And second, to interact with the outside air. Its particles had to be about the same size as the particles of natural folk. Fujiko worked with engineers to create an environment to realize a folk experience to meet these requirements. This exploration is in common with her father, Nakaya Ukichiro's emphasis on the process of experimentation. Based on the process importance, project Fujiko put into practice was David Tudor's Island Eye, Island Ear, 1974, environmental concert on the Swedish island with kite artist Jacqueline Mattis. It was the first folk project she was involved in after the expo. The search for the island continued, moving the location from Sweden to the United States. The island size, shape, vegetation, water system, geology, and other environmental conditions were observed and recorded, and weather observations were made. Despite Billy Kluber, EAT's founders' best efforts, this grand concert, which aspired to fuse the environment and technology, science and art, ended up unfinished due to the lack of funding, with no organization or company to subsidize or invest in it. As I have repeatedly emphasized, the importance of folk as a medium and experience of folk is the key to understand Fujiko Nakaya's work. The invention of the folk sculpture, which has no form, creates various experiences depending on the climate, and it makes the experience of folk a device that works on the memory of each person. Earth Talk is the best example of this. 2 years after Island Year, Fujiko was invited to participate in the Sydney Biennial, Australia. She created the work called Earth Talk, which covered the entire lawn of the civic park in front of the museum with folk. This Earth Talk was the first time a folk sculpture was officially recognized as an art form. Instead of going to the beach, children visited the foggy shore every day in their bathing suits, repeatedly going in and out of the fog, followed by adults and dogs. This experience with children, she wanted to return this primordial joy of seeing nature through fog to the children. This determination remains unchanged for her today. And she is also trying to do new project with children, for instance, Pokemon Go or something. And Fujiko states that what interested in her in video was the utility of feedback, which she shares with folk. The utility of video is not mechanical feedback, but the process of emotion, memories, and feelings interacting with each other. Process of interaction between emotions, memories, and feelings is what makes video so exciting. Fujiko learned this from Michael Schamberg, author of Guerrilla Television. Michael Schamberg says that when he showed her mother the feedback, her mother, who had not smiled in decades, laughed. This influenced Fujiko very much. Sojiji, here a new version of installation shown at this exhibition. Sojiji is a documentary. Fujiko found the similarities between the folk process and the Zen group movement. And she said, when cloud particles collide, they grow larger and fall under their weight. The aesthetics of this cloud phenomenon, which is like an ideal model of democracy, seems to work as an existential model of a Zen-like group. It is an order of non-discrimination and quality. And I wanted to conclude with some examples of the thinking of Ukichiro and Torahiko Terada. So I cannot describe deeply the scientific things, but I wanted to share some similarities between the scientific eyes to phenomena, and Fujiko's eyes. And Nakaya Ukichiro was a world-known Japanese experimental physicist who succeeded in making the world's first artificial snow crystals in 1936. Artificial snow made by Ukichiro is basically identical to natural snow in terms of its formation process and properties. and entirely that is both artificial and natural at the same time. Those Ukichiro's scientific endeavors seem to lie, in a sense, in bridging the mutual relation between the nature and the artificial. These democratic eyes toward the nature by Ukichiro seems to be very close to Fujiko. And Ukichiro said, I recall that in our artificial snow experiments, there were at times some failures. We were therefore delighted to find similar mishaps in natural snow. In preparing papers for presentation, we select only the photographs of well-formed crystals we have made, but in fact, there were and still are considerable number of failures. There are times when a crystal that starts on the right track will suddenly make a wrong turn and assume a shape that defies any attempt at categorization. Such oddities that cannot be identified as crystals are considered failure, and we must start all over again. And also, this is also, you can see the exhibition. And the Ukichiro was also deeply influenced by the idea of physics of form, which the teacher Torahiko Terada often mentioned. And this is a quote, and as one such topic, Terada considered physics of form, concerning which he frequently said, if the forms of phenomena are the same, then as phenomena they are governed by the same laws. To pass over the similarity of forms as merely a superficial agreement is to act as a person who does not understand the true meaning of the word form. Terada's words have a very deep meaning, for he did not only meditate upon the idea, he also did actual research into the forms that appear in various phenomena. His research into fluctuous electric sparks, sparklers, and the flow of charcoal calligraphy ink all share the underlying theme of research into forms. And so finding, I believe this is the only quote, and finding a form in seemingly chaotic environment is, I believe, also an act of making other invisible parts of the form visible. So I want to show this is the latest Fujiko's work in Himeji in Japan that just showed. And thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much to Hiroko Tasaka for this path through works that we are familiar with. A couple of them we are, but most we didn't. And thank you also for showing the image of the very last work that must have happened in the last weeks, I imagine. And it was a premiere, but also a sort of document that witnesses how Fujiko Nakaya is restless and never stops working and sharing her work in unusual contexts that are very rarely museums, often are open public spaces that, as you brilliantly raised, as much as possible addressed to younger audiences, childs in particular. It's now the moment for Catherine Wood. We are looking forward to your meandering throughout the experience of working with Fujiko, but also encountering the exhibition that you must have thinking about for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you. seeing as I am last in a very rich and dense day, I'm glad you're looking forward to me meandering. Thanks very much for inviting me, and also congratulations to you, Andrea, and your team for making this impossible exhibition happen. It's absolutely magnificent, and I know from my own curatorial work how difficult and it is to make this fog sculpture happen inside the gallery. So the miraculous has been achieved, and it's really just so fantastic to be here and see it. I'm going to talk a bit about the things I've addressed in my text on Fujiko that's in your catalogue, really in terms of picture making and, you know, Fujiko's sculptures, the cloud sculptures are talked about mostly in terms of sculpture, but really I wanted to think about them in relation to painting, especially because of the way you've brought the early drawings and paintings together so beautifully in this exhibition. And also, more widely, maybe in relation to the concept of observation that's fundamental to physics and science. Actually, we haven't talked about this yet, Michelle, but my father's a physicist too, an astronomer who spent his life going observing. Observing's what you do, looking at the sky at night. So I was really interested looking at Fujiko's body of work in relation to her father's documentation and work on snowflakes, with her early beginnings in observational drawing and what that really means. Andrea, you said to me when I was in the central gallery to stand at one end and look at the work as an image, which I did, but at the beginning I was standing in the middle, and I had this incredible experience of the two fogs from both sides coming for me. And in terms of the kinds of pictures that Fujiko Nakaya is making in the form of painting, I'm fascinated by the extent to which it is an environmental painting which implicates us, which we are part of, rather than something to look at. And I want to just think about how she does it and what that means. And I'm actually at Tate Modern right now working with another incredible artist with a 50-year body of work, Cecilia Vicuña, who, a Chilean artist who talks, as a poet and as an artist, she talks a lot about humidity and our status as humans and our dependence on humidity and the humus, the earth, and, you know, the precarity of humidity that is the fundamental basis of our survival on the planet, the pale blue dot, which is, you know, the blue haze of the atmosphere. That's part of who we are and our survival. So the pictures that Fujiko Nakaya is making are a form of painting in and with the very substance that's fundamental to our survival and the substance that is under threat. And her form of the sublime is her posing, I think, of that duality, of the miracle of the appearance of this fog of water vapor suspended in the air and the threat of its disappearance which hangs with it. And this is one of her fogscapes in the forest, which is so beautiful and pictorial and kind of evokes that history of sublime romantic painting. There is, of course, I had a couple of fun pictures for the end of the day, but a history to the use of fog in pictoriality on stage, the romantic ballet, Swan Lake, or in horror films, of course, you know, where the fog is kind of personified as a malevolent force. And I put those images in to think about what Fujiko Nakaya's work is not, which is, you know, a narrative. It's not narrative association of those sorts, but more this extraordinary kind of picture that's spatial and extending in all directions. And as she said it herself, it's a way, like, you know, iodine in the veins, it's a way of tracking the movements of the atmosphere by making them visible through the use of the fog. To some extent, she's projecting the fog into a space, but then, especially in the outdoor works, It's about how the atmosphere, the wind, the air pressure, the currents of the air carry the substance in order, and her work makes that visible as a kind of painting. Her distribution, her distribution of water dispersed as fog, so then is not only something to see, but an environment in which our bodies find, a kind of affinity at a cellular level. And that cellular level is something which is very interesting in relation to those extraordinary early paintings. I think I've got quite a few slides here of the cloud studies, but what I really wanted to get onto is looking at these incredible paintings that she was doing early on with that attention to detail. And I don't know how other people feel about the show, but it's extraordinary, as Andrea was telling me about the mechanics of how they've made the containment of fog possible in the galleries here with the water beds, is the way in which water is attracted to water, which keeps the fog moving back towards itself. And I certainly, for one, feel that same kind of attraction to the fog and even to the river outside, the water that is of us. And I think the theorist Astrida Nemanis has written about it so beautifully, our fishy beginnings, our affinity with water, and our water memory in the cells of our bodies, which is this continued attraction and circulation that runs through all of us, all of life on this planet. The water in the glass that we're drinking has been evaporated, precipitated, bathed in, pissed out. It's this continuous water cycle that Nakaya draws out in the fog sculptures, but within which we are implicated. The paintings that she began with, as Hiroko was just saying, were labeled by Fujiko as decompositions. And although she was working with oil paint, she was often using turpentine to take the paint off again. So she was almost working with it in a manner that's more akin to watercolor. And I just love seeing the detail and the intricacy of the observational material in these paintings and drawings, where you see kind of tree forms, cellular forms, drawings of clouds, some that are kind of going in a more fantastical direction, perhaps. But I like the way that she's talked in interviews about her father's processes of observation, observing snow and ice, and saying to her, if you want to know about ice, you must listen to the ice. And you can see that equivalent approach of Nakaya in the earliest work to listening to the organic environment around her. And I wanted to think about the status of these paintings maybe in relation to the environmental paintings through the lens of the research of Fernando Dominguez Rubio, who did the long residency at MoMA fairly recently, who talks beautifully about all art as land art, and the Van Gogh painting actually as this kind of knot of minerals and ground up seeds of oil and of the woven threads of canvas made from plants on the planet. These knots of materials from the earth, from the land, that are continuously in a state of disintegration, and that the museum works to keep into a form that is stable. Nakaya's form of painting, by contrast, is really taking that process of continuous undoing and disintegration that is organic life on this planet and making it the central feature of her work. And like I said, it's that magical, miraculous appearance and threat of disappearance which continues with it. Her fog sculptures are, as she says, a probe of the environment and a way of sensitizing her viewers to what's there in nature. They're not benign or decorative, uses of fog, much as they're incredibly popular here with many, many visitors. And I wanted to, before we maybe go on to talk as a group, I just wanted to say something about my perception in relation to her conversation and dialogue with Rauschenberg and those other artists of EAT, you know, and Rauschenberg being very much influenced by John Cage. Earlier on in the talk, Dieter was saying something about Japanese technology being the means and, you know, the North American ideology framing the work of that period. And I actually was thinking about and writing a little bit in my essay about the huge influence of D.T. Suzuki, a Zen Buddhist monk who, as I'm sure you know, was lecturing in America in the 1950s and a huge influence on John Cage and many others in terms of his understanding of impermanence, transcendence, the power of the void, and, you know, his Suzuki's idea of the infinite canvas of time and space. That approach to impermanence and chance was something fundamental to the kind of New York scene that Rauschenberg was a part of and that Nakaya intersected with in these projects. But it strikes me, you know, experiencing especially her outdoor fog painting in the environment, that her version of blurring of art and life absolutely kind of exploded that ambition beyond, you know, out into the universe in a way that was much more radical and went much further than many of those artists, in fact. And this, you know, when we were working on the project together at Tate Modern, I was really struck by this process of observation that Fujiko engaged with, standing outside on the landscape, the south landscape outside Tate, where she was making the work. I think my slides have stopped, but I do have a slide somewhere there. Sorry. Again. Anyway, she spent a long time outside looking and just feeling the atmosphere there. And it's actually a very difficult space outside Tate. In fact, we opened this lovely, the tank spaces downstairs, and then this kind of arena on top at the back of the museum, and then realized that the wind there makes it really difficult and often quite unpleasant to stage things there. But she spent this time photographing, being there, looking, really, really thinking in the build-up to making the work. And I was quite concerned as the curator at first that there were these incredibly strong gusts of wind that would come and blow the whole fog sculpture away at regular intervals. And I thought, oh, this, you know, does this mean it doesn't work? It's kind of ruined. And she was just absolutely confident with the cyclicality of course, it's like swimming in a rough sea. You know there'll be 3 big waves, but then it kind of, well, hopefully, usually calms again. She knew that there would be these moments where the work was obliterated and that then it would appear again for a while, and she kind of worked with that rhythm of appearance and disappearance so beautifully. And I think, just to conclude, that spirit that she brings, and I love the fact that you've included the film here too, of the monks, is so fundamental to many of the questions we're grappling with now in terms of climate action and climate emergency, and many of the questions that came up earlier in the discussion about the metaverse and networked existence, this way in which she's decentering the status of human activity by staging a form of painting which she is not in control. She's not controlling entirely. She's intervening and allowing the workings of the atmosphere to kind of carry the gesture that she's made, and proposing this extraordinary kind of symbiotic image of a dynamic painterly gesture that's in the air. I think I'll stop there. I was going to mention a young choreographer, but we can talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Catherine. It was a hard challenge to breach the only sealed room we have in the show, the room without door facing the Fox sculpture, the room with the paintings, with the broader practice of Fujiko Nakaya. So you made it beautifully, and I'm sure everyone appreciated this. Definitely extraordinary journey, as I say, that Catherine, you made. It's the end of the day, it's almost 7:30, and I think perhaps what we can do is we skip and we open up directly to the question of the audience. If you have questions for our three wonderful guests, they will be very appreciated. There's one question over there.
Thank you. Oh, yeah. Thank you, all three of you, for the wonderful presentations. I have a question to Michelle. So I was wondering also when seeing the exhibition here about the significance of the inside and outside for Nakaya. And so you had mentioned that in the Pepsi Pavilion, first she thought she was going to show the sculpture indoors, but then it ended up outdoors and she went along with it. So I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about this question and how she talks about it.
Yeah, I think it evolved, over time, obviously, and part of what's so fascinating about these collective experiments is that it truly is it's a dialogical experience, right? It's not something where an author says, I'm going to do this, and then that's what they do. It sort of morphs over time because there are other people, there are other agents, there are unruly materials at hand. And so I think what happened when the fog went outside or started outside was that, of course, it can be that much more connected to external environmental conditions, but it also has, maybe connecting to what Catherine was saying, it has a distinct pictorial or visual relationship to whatever it is in front of or immersed within. So I think those were properties that really started to fascinate her. But then you see, again, in many different incarnations, different experiments with what this type of transparency, opacity, or interiority or exteriority could mean, and she just becomes a kind of virtuosic player at that. But I think the other part is whether it's internal or external, she is playing with the contingency, with the aleatoric nature of the fog, right? You don't know exactly what it's going to do. You can couch it in certain ways or shape it in certain ways, but you don't know what it's going to do. And at the same time, what I always found fascinating was the relationship between that quote-unquote environmental or external phenomena that we connect to nature and the weather and everything that's outside, but then how intimately connected that is, or that I think she found it to be, to what we see as infrastructural networks of circuitry and sound waves and radio waves and telecommunications and these other kinds of phenomena that are harnessing statistical uses of chance into actually a technocratic system. So I think that is one way of thinking, that she was thinking about interiority and exteriority.
Thanks.
It's a question, is it loud? Okay. It's a question to all of you because I find it very interesting that you all did shows with Nakaya. And I was wondering in how far you understand her work as conceptual. So, because from like a performative or let's say production perspective, actually my question is more like, as a curator myself working with Nakaya's work, I was wondering if she also leaves us kind of like concepts and papers and stuff to work with, so in the future we can also develop shows about her work.
I think all art's conceptual after conceptual art, same as all art's land art, but so hard to answer. If she leaves scores, do you mean that? Yeah.
You know, like a bit like Solvit, for example, you know?
Yeah.
It's like the best
Instructions
example.
to remake the work.
Yeah.
This is a live question that some of us are grappling with, yes. Not really in that sense, does she? She doesn't. It's more material than that in terms of how it relates to the site. Like the only museum that's collected a fog work successfully, I think, is Bilbao, where it's in situ. And it is a question a number of us are engaged with. But they're more, in my understanding, there's such a material specificity to how they operate in the environment, especially the outdoor ones, that it's not a score that could easily be replicated in a kind of akin to conceptual practices.
I agree with this, and yeah, very site specific. For the first time, I saw so many conceptual materials in the exhibition. Usually since maybe Anne-Marie Duguay's book or an archive, so she did many archival materials. Then so actually she didn't want to show such materials for the concept. So for the moment we can so think about it's conceptual or not, and because of there are so many archival materials.
And I haven't actually produced one of these works. It's my connection to it is archival and experiential, but I would just add that this work in Canberra in Australia that she created is a really fascinating example because it itself, I mean, it basically changed the landscape itself. So things started growing and the environment changed because of the fog's presence. And that I thought was an example, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, of a kind of untamed aspect to her work that she was happy to let it change and be changed.
Thank you for so precisely raising the question about the practice of Fujiko Nakaya. As Catherine said, the work is the work with the public. And actually, when Fujiko Nakaya came to generate what we could call a director's cut of the fog sculpture. You may know we opened the show at the beginning of April and the artist couldn't attend. She came a month after. Actually, she had no problem in working with the audience throughout 10 days, somehow confirming the fact that the exhibition site is a production site, but she needed the audience on site to, on the one hand, create the score, on the other one also to interpret the behavior of the fog sculpture with the actual public around. So, and it really changed dramatically. Everyone who was here, for instance, Anne-Marie Duguay, can witness this big change. I guess there is one more question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have to say my question is a little bit vague, so I start and I hope I can formulate this as a question. So there was this one moment where Suzuki was mentioned. I think Catherine Wood was mentioning Suzuki and explaining like his influence to Europe. And that's true, there is a huge influence coming from him if you look like Zen and the mind of beginners and so on and so forth. But there's also another tradition that is connected to Suzuki. Brian Victoria wrote a very interesting book which gives a lot of information about Suzuki and his connection to the Nazi Germany and how he was working with the Nazis together. So there's also another step of having the militarism of Zen Buddhism in the Meiji Restoration times. So Zen Buddhism, there is not really there is an innocence, but they were also used at that time. So there are images of Zen warriors having that. Then we have Philip Johnson and with MoMA, also a Nazi. Then we have the Mount Fuji images that Helmut was also, Max was explaining. So there is a kind of fascism topics also here that comes, but they're not really mentioned. They're not contextualized. And I was just wondering, is there perhaps a way to look at that also, to find ways to this kind of vague spots, they're really vaguely connected with each other, put them together and tell about the fascism in Japan and she after the Second World War. I don't know if I could give an idea like what interests me.
Well,
I mean,
go, Catherine, please. No, absolutely.
equipped to answer. Maybe that's a next step. I suppose I was just making a more simple connection between her mention of Zen, the film in the show, and the philosophy that was attributed to a certain group of Western artists in a way, but this full circle, the full circle connection, which has been talked about before. But maybe that is something I don't know who's already written about that, but it's an interesting point.
Well, one immediate, I didn't go into it, but when I said techno-nationalist pomp at Expo 70, it's all of those things, right? And it's this first really huge event in Asia after World War II. So the huge discourse around it is, of course, historical amnesia, like let's wipe the slate clean in the seat of obviously imperial ambition and the horrors of the war. So that's, I think, completely embedded in many of these projects, but also just specifically when I look at the Pepsi Pavilion, what I think is fascinating is that many of the other types of events or projects in the expo were dismissed as precisely trying to paper over the past. But what I think, and I think that the Pepsi Pavilion really does, is actually not necessarily literally reckon with the past, obviously, but it is in some ways trying to remap subject-object relations, and that is a political act in and of itself. I think the relationship to the simulacrum, for example, is fascinating, as well as to this kind of materialist bid for presence. So those are ways that maybe are structural and formal, but I think are every bit as much trying to grapple with this extremely violent and present near past.
I think we also discussed the fact that I had tried to ask Fujiko about the cloud in relation to the atomic cloud, but it wasn't a conversation, it wasn't a direction she particularly wanted to explore.
She's very aware of folk seems misunderstood by gas. Gas in Europe is she is very all the time sensitive to the folk. And also in Europe, the folk means very different meaning, and very sensitive to that. Then, so that's why I said, but and also she grew up in she was educated in U.S., so I think different. So her perspective is very originally came from U.S. and not typical Japanese direction, I think.
I can add, and I should be very grateful for the three of you for stretching and engaging with such a complicated, long question. I can add that, yes, working with Fujiko, we had this discussion quite often, and it was a very specific preoccupation she had, more on the side of the interpretation of the work. and not, of course, on the side of the creation of the work, how the work can be read. There are specific contributions that we can share later that touch upon the point, of course, not of the work of Fujiko, but about what is at stake in the two countries. Then I am obliged to say that on a curatorial point of view, we decided on purpose in this building, as every curatorial decision we do and we take, to begin a new cycle by hosting Fujiko Nakaya with a specific intention, and not by chance. We invited a German younger artist whose connection to Fujiko Nakaya, it's explicit and strong, to react not only to her work and to the legacy of her father, but also to how this building can be differently, no? And how softening can be a strategy, but also in the very background, how the two countries had something that they shared, which is extremely complicated and problematic back almost 90 years ago. So that's but more than we go more on the, let's say, curatorial strategies that we don't necessarily want to make public, but we're happy to share in exactly this situation. If there is no further question, it's definitely the moment of thank everyone who attended. So first, the audience, you were extraordinary in spending this day with us. And also, and above all, Dieter Daniels, Arion Dongus, who joins remotely, Anne-Marie Duguet, Hayden Guest for the effort in Moed this morning, and not only, and Gorizawa, who is here with us in the first line, and Michel Cour, and Katrin Wood, and Philip Ram, and Jenna Sutela, and next to me, Hiroko Tasaka, and Takuyo Tsunoda, Helmut Völter, and Miyu as well. And last but not least, I know she's still with us. This is the list of everyone who take part. Sarah Johanna Toyer, who conceived and curated carefully this symposium and the exhibition. I also want to say that the program of Haus der Kunst, as the exhibition, but everything we're doing, this symposium as well, is supported by the Freunde der Haus der Kunst, by the Alexander Tutzek Stiftung, by the Bayerische Staat Ministerium für Wissenschaft und Kunst, and everyone who was in the room on the technical side made a miracle, and not only the technical side, also who supported us here, Anne Pfauch, Teresa Retze, Camilla Trey, and then everyone who collaborated made it wonderful without any uncertainty. So I'm very happy and blessed. And last but not least, you might have had a sound, a music in the moment we entered. And this is a transitional space normally. And the sound you had is a new composition called Land by Igor Ukuniev, an artist and musician from Ukraine, who will be taking over the space through his sound and his composition in the next 9 months until April. This is a proposal that comes from our sound and music curator, Sarah Miles. You might remember, who is in Munich, that this is the space where Lamin Fofana, A Call to Disorder, was up for almost 1 year. And now it's the moment of Igor and his specific approach to what does it mean to live and be an artist and still create in a country that is under aggression from another country. So, as you may know, the show remains open until midnight, and you are all invited to, again, navigate the show for Fujiko Nakaya and the other exhibition. And thank you so much, everyone who took part, and everyone who stayed with us, and looking forward to seeing you in the next days and the next months again at Haus der Kunst. Thank you.